Caroline Levitt, with a microphone clipped to her blouse and arrogance in every word, stepped forward and said it. "Sit down, boy." She thought she was being clever. What she didn't realize was who she was speaking to. A Coldstream Guard who'd once stood under fire in Kandahar and never flinched. And when he replied, it left the whole of America speechless. Want to see exactly how it unfolded? First, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. You know that particular kind of London afternoon where the sky hangs low and grey, but there's still something magical about the light catching the palace stone. That's exactly what it was like as the daily changing of the guard wound down, the final notes of brass still echoing faintly across the cobblestones. The courtyard outside Buckingham Palace had that perfect post-ceremony, tourists lingering behind rope barriers, phones finally lowered but eyes still wide with wonder. Everything was orderly, dignified, photogenic, exactly what it was supposed to be. Then the American delegation emerged from the palace's west corridor. You know, the tight buttoned suits, crisp clipboards, and that particular energy that comes with having very important places to be. At the center of the group strode a woman who commanded attention without asking for it. Caroline Levitt, former White House press secretary, now a rising political personality with a knack for turning moments into headlines. Mid-30s, blonde, wearing a tailored navy coat that probably costs more than most people's monthly rent. Her stride was sharp, purposeful, and already mic'd for sound. Behind her, a three-man camera crew followed like a perfectly choreographed shadow. She wasn't in London to make trouble, at least not officially. This was part of some cross-Atlantic cultural diplomacy series, something about allied messaging and media optics. But Caroline didn't do background noise. She did moments, the kind that went viral, got shared, became talking points. And this courtyard, with its pristine stone and scarlet uniformed guards, definitely had potential. As the delegation paused near the main archway, Caroline's eyes landed on a figure posted beneath the high Rotaian gate. Lance Corporal Elijah Ward, Coldstream Guards, stood at ceremonial attention, still as carved marble. His black bearskin helmet cast shadows across his face. His crimson tunic was pressed to perfection, and his rifle rested at precisely the correct angle against his shoulder. His presence wasn't loud or demanding. It just was like he'd been carved from the same stone as the palace itself. Caroline squinted, that calculating look she got when she spotted an opportunity. "Hold up," she said over her shoulder to a cameraman, never taking her eyes off the motionless guard. "Don't cut, this is too perfect." The crew adjusted their equipment as she casually approached the rope barrier. A second microphone was clipped to her collar, ready to catch every word. "Looks like they've got one standing just for us," she remarked, gesturing lightly toward Elijah without crossing the designated boundary. "Real regal cosplay, huh?" Her sound tech smirked. One of the British aides accompanying the delegation winced visibly. Elijah didn't move, didn't even seem to register her presence. His dark eyes remained fixed on that distant point. Guards are trained to focus on somewhere beyond the crowd, beyond the cameras, beyond whatever momentary drama might unfold at his feet. A fraction of a second too long past the kind of pause that makes people uncomfortable without quite knowing why. Caroline turned slightly toward her producer, voice still bright and camera-ready. "No, but seriously, imagine standing like that for hours. I'd lose circulation in places I didn't know I had." There was a small laugh from behind the lens, another more pronounced wince from the British staffer beside her. But Caroline wasn't looking for approval from them. She was looking for content. Her voice stayed chipper, but something sharper was starting to show around the edges. Across the courtyard, a couple near the fountain stopped mid-selfie and began recording, not because of the guard, but because something in Caroline's tone had shifted the atmosphere. That particular kind of tension that builds when someone doesn't quite realize they're crossing a line, or maybe does, and enjoys the ambiguity. And yet, Elijah Ward remained perfectly still. A light breeze stirred the crimson fabric of his sleeve. A pigeon landed near his polished boot, pecked at something invisible, then fluttered away. He didn't so much as blink. Caroline studied him with that practiced look of someone accustomed to getting reactions. "Not even a twitch," she said, smiling for the camera. "Maybe he's just ignoring us. I can respect that." The lighting was perfect, the shot was clean, everything was going exactly according to plan. What none of them could see, what none of them could possibly understand, was the quiet awareness building behind the guard's composed exterior. Not anger, not wounded pride, just the practiced vigilance of someone who spent a lifetime being underestimated and has learned to recognize the moment when stillness becomes its own kind of power. Because Lance Corporal Elijah Ward understood something that most people never learn. Sometimes the strongest response is no response at all. The rope between them was more than just a physical barrier. It was about to become a line between two very different kinds of strength, and only one of them knew what was coming. You saw Elijah Ward standing there in his crimson tunic and bearskin hat. You might think what most tourists think, that he's some kind of ceremonial decoration, a living statue put there for photos and pageantry. You'd be wrong. Elijah was 31 years old, born in Brixton to a Jamaican father and an English mother. raised in a cramped two-bedroom flat above a convenience shop, where pride wasn't something you announced, it was something you carried in how you held yourself when the world tried to bend you. His father, Harold, had driven the number 37 bus through Clapham for 27 years, every single day, rain or shine, through strikes and riots and everything London could throw at him. Harold never missed a shift, never raised his voice, even when passengers called him names that stuck like tar on the windows. "You don't bark back at every dog that yaps," Harold told his son once, watching him nurse a bloody nose from a playground fight. "You outlast the noise. That's how you win." Elijah joined the British Army at 18 not because he romanticized the military life, but because it offered two things his neighborhood couldn't: structure and respect. Respect that had to be earned, not given. After basic training, he specialized in signals and convoy logistics, the unglamorous work of keeping supply lines open in places where a wrong turn could get you killed. At 22, he was stationed in Kandahar as part of a multinational joint task force. His job was simple in theory: escort vulnerable supply convoys through terrain where nothing was ever quite what it seemed. On his third deployment, everything changed. The roadside IED was buried deep, hidden beneath what looked like scattered rubble. When it detonated, it flipped their armored vehicles sideways off a narrow bridge, crushing the radio unit and killing the driver instantly. Elijah found himself trapped in the twisted wreckage, breathing through grit and blood, with something sharp digging into his ribs every time he moved. That's when he heard the whimpering. An Afghan interpreter, barely out of his teens, legs pinned beneath a section of dashboard, fading in and out of consciousness beside him. The kid had been laughing about his new baby daughter just minutes before the blast. Elijah didn't panic. He didn't scream for help. He reached through the smoke and sparks for what remained of the communications equipment, rerouted the broken connection through a backup repeater, and began tapping out a coded emergency transmission, using just 2 fingers and an elbow braced against hot metal. Then he waited. 2 hours, then 4. He stayed conscious, stayed focused, kept the kid talking about his daughter until the rescue helicopters finally appeared on the horizon. When the medics arrived, Elijah refused morphine until the interpreter was loaded onto the chopper first. The official commendation praised his exceptional composure under extreme duress and selfless dedication to preserving life. The citation sat in an envelope under his bed back home, next to his discharge papers and a faded letter from his father that he'd never answered. When the Coldstream Guards recruited him for ceremonial rotation, he said yes, not because he wanted to play dress-up for tourists, but because he understood what that uniform represented: discipline that didn't need to announce itself, strength that didn't require volume. He'd stood in that exact spot when heads of state walked past, when protesters screamed about imperialism, when drunk tourists tried to make him laugh with increasingly ridiculous antics. None of them had moved him, not physically, not emotionally, but today felt different. He could hear Caroline before he could see her clearly, that particular kind of voice that treated everything as performance and everyone as props. Sharp, practiced, always projecting just a little too much. When she called his uniform cosplay, something inside his chest shifted. Not anger, not even hurt. Just the cold recognition of someone who'd heard it all before in a dozen different languages, in places where words like that could get people killed. He kept his eyes forward, focused on that distant point beyond the crowd, but part of him was already calculating, already preparing, because some battles aren't fought with fists or guns or raised voices. Some battles are won by refusing to move. And Elijah Ward had never lost one of those. Caroline stood with one hand on her hip, the other gesturing casually toward the motionless figure in red. Her microphone was still live, the camera still rolling. She was in her element, confident, performative, working the moment. "They don't even blink," she said to her cameraman with a practiced grin. "It's actually kind of impressive. Like, what happens if he sneezes? Do they write him up for movement?" Someone on her crew chuckled. A younger member of the State Department team let out a nervous laugh that sounded forced, even to his own ears. Elijah remained exactly where he'd been for the past 2 hours, perfectly centered beneath the stone archway, rifle steady, chin lifted just so, boots aligned with military precision. His dark eyes stayed fixed on that invisible horizon that guards learned to see. Caroline tilted her head, like she was examining a particularly interesting museum piece. "God, I honestly don't know how they do it," she continued, playing to the lens. "If someone made me stand still in a silly hat for 5 hours, I'd absolutely lose my mind." She turned back toward the camera, always half-performing. "I mean, look at him. You could probably replace him with a mannequin, and nobody would even notice the difference." The cameraman's chuckle was less enthusiastic this time. Even he was starting to sense that something about this felt off. That's when she crossed the line. Caroline took one step closer to the rope barrier, angled herself for the perfect shot, and with her practiced smirk firmly in place and her voice raised just enough for everyone to hear, she said, "It's sit down, boy. You're making the rest of us look stiff." The words landed like a slap across the courtyard. Not because they were loud, they weren't, but because they were sharp, casual, familiar in all the wrong ways. The kind of comment delivered too smoothly to be completely thoughtless, too comfortable to be innocent. The silence that followed wasn't the polite quiet of a ceremonial space, it was the heavy, suffocating silence of a line crossed that couldn't be UNCROSSED. 20 feet away, the black British security officer stationed near the gate visibly stiffened. His hand moved instinctively toward the radio clipped to his vest, then stopped, hovering there like he wasn't sure what protocol covered this particular situation. A mother standing near the barrier felt her stomach drop and instinctively pulled her young daughter closer. Two American tourists who'd been filming the ceremony slowly lowered their phones, their expressions shifting from amusement to something much more uncomfortable. Behind Caroline, a mid-level diplomat in a gray suit cleared his throat and said, "Quietly, Caroline, perhaps we should keep moving with the schedule." She waved him off without even looking back because she hadn't seen it yet, hadn't noticed how the laughter had completely died, how even the British aides trained in every possible shade of diplomatic damage control had gone completely still. She just kept standing there, smiling that media smile, waiting for someone to give her the reaction she thought she deserved. Elijah still hadn't moved, not so much as a twitch, but everything else had changed. The tourists weren't taking pictures anymore. Conversations had died mid. Even the pigeons seemed to sense that something fundamental had shifted in the courtyard because everyone there had heard the word boy, not soldier, not sir, not even guard. Boy. The kind of word that doesn't just insult, it erases, that carries the weight of history like a chain around someone's neck, that turns a decorated combat veteran into a prop with one careless syllable and a microphone. But Elijah didn't react because that's what people like Caroline never understand. They think silence means surrender, that stillness equals weakness, that ceremony is just dress up for grown-ups. They don't know that silence can be loaded like a weapon, that composure can cut deeper than any comeback, that some men have learned to absorb every insult without ever lowering their eyes or losing their dignity. Caroline turned back to her crew, oblivious to the change in atmosphere. "All right," she said brightly, "let's grab some more shots. Over by the gates. I think we've got enough palace footage for the segment." The rope line wasn't breathing normally anymore. The crowd wasn't moving, and Lance Corporal Elijah Ward remained exactly where he'd been, motionless, dignified, unbroken. But the next time he moved, it wouldn't be because someone told him to. It would be because he chose to. The moment stretched like a held breath. That's how these things usually work, right? Someone says something inappropriate, people pretend not to hear it, and everyone moves on. Keep the cameras rolling, find a new angle, let embarrassment fade into background noise. But it wasn't fading. The silence after Caroline's words had settled over the courtyard like fog, thick, heavy, impossible to ignore. The kind of quiet that makes your chest tight and your palms sweat, even when you're not sure why. Near the fountain, a father held his young daughter's hand. She looked up at him with those wide, innocent eyes that see too much. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging on his jacket. "Why did that lady call a soldier boy?" The man stared at the back of Caroline's head as she chatted with her producer like nothing had happened. When he finally answered, his voice was barely audible, but somehow carried clearly in the stillness, "Because she doesn't see the man standing in front of her, sweetheart." A few feet down the rope line, an elderly black woman in a navy coat stepped slightly forward. She spoke to no one in particular, but her words rang with the authority of lived experience. "My grandson wore a uniform like that. Different colors, but same bearing, same pride." Her voice grew quieter but somehow more forceful. "And people called him boy too, right up until the day he didn't come home." The tourist beside her, a middle-aged white man with a camera around his neck, looked down at his feet. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Don't be sorry," she replied, eyes fixed on Elijah's motionless form. "Just remember what you saw here." The camera crew had stopped adjusting their equipment. The sound tech was no longer checking levels. They weren't really filming anymore, not because they'd been told to stop, but because none of them could figure out how to frame what was happening. They'd come looking for clean royal bureau-like content, palace pageantry. Instead, they'd stumbled into something that felt historic. That's when a crisp voice cut through the tension. Professional.com, but carrying an edge that made everyone turn. "Ma'am," the voice belonged to a British officer in dress uniform, dark blue with polished brass, ribbons displayed with understated precision. Captain Nina Finch stepped forward with the measured pace of someone accustomed to managing situations that had gone sideways. "Please step back from the ceremonial perimeter." Caroline turned, blinking in surprise. "Excuse me." Finch's expression remained perfectly neutral. "You're currently addressing an active member of the Queen's Guard on palace grounds. That constitutes a violation of standing protocol. Please return to the designated visitor pathway." Caroline's media-trained smile flickered on. "Look, I was just making conversation. I didn't touch him or anything. Physical contact isn't required to cross boundaries," Finch replied evenly. "Your words were inappropriate and disrespectful to a serving member of His Majesty's Armed Forces." Behind Caroline, the American diplomatic staff exchanged uncomfortable glances. No one stepped forward to support her. The moment had shifted too far for damage control. "I didn't mean anything by it," Caroline said. her voice taking on a defensive edge. It was just, a joke. People film these guys all the time. Finch let the silence do the work for a moment. When she spoke again, her tone was softer but somehow more cutting. Intent doesn't determine impact, Miss Levitt, and some jokes reveal more about the person telling them than their intended target. Caroline looked around, searching for support that wasn't coming. She could feel the moment slipping away from her, the narrative she'd thought she was controlling rewriting itself in real time. "I mean, he's just standing there," she said, her voice rising slightly. "It's not like he's actually doing anything." That's when it happened. A teenage boy in a school uniform, couldn't have been more than 15, looked up from his phone with the kind of moral clarity that only comes from not yet learning to be polite about injustice. "He's doing everything," the kid said. Not loudly, but with absolute conviction. "He's representing something bigger than himself, and you've just tried to make him smaller." The words hung in the air like a judgment. Simple, devastating. True. Caroline opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Because, what do you say to that? How do you argue with truth delivered by someone young enough to still believe that dignity matters more than likes and shares? Behind her, through the crowd, another voice joined in, this one older, weathered, carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who'd worn a uniform himself. "That guard's probably seen more combat than half the politicians giving orders on television," the man said to his companion, but loud enough for others to hear. "And she calls him boy like he's some kind of decoration." More heads turned, more whispers. The crowd was beginning to find its voice, and it wasn't supporting Caroline's version of events. Still, Elijah hadn't moved, hadn't acknowledged any of it. He stood like a lighthouse in a storm, fixed, steady, unmovable. But something had changed in the space around him. The silence wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to everyone who understood what they'd witnessed. Everyone who recognized the difference between performance and presence. Everyone who knew that some things shouldn't be moved no matter how many cameras are watching. And for the first time in her career, Caroline Levitt found herself in a story where she wasn't the protagonist. She was just someone who'd said the wrong thing to the right person. And everyone was watching to see what happened next. The tension had reached that breaking point where something has to give, where silence becomes so heavy it demands to be broken. The entire courtyard seemed to lean forward, waiting. Then finally, Elijah moved, not dramatically, not with anger or performance, just a slow, deliberate turn of his head. Lance Corporal Elijah Ward looked directly at Caroline Levitt with eyes that had seen more than she could imagine. The smile disappeared from her face instantly. When he spoke, his voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the quiet authority of someone who'd earned the right to be heard. "You called me boy," he said, each word precise and measured. "Let me tell you what that word has cost." The courtyard went completely silent. Even the traffic noise from the mall seemed to fade. "My grandfather laid railway tracks from Sheffield to Birmingham 6 days a week, rain or snow, for 37 years. People shouted boy at him while he carried steel that weighed more than their cars called it tradition." He paused, but his gaze never wavered. "My father was a paramedic with the London Ambulance Service, pulled bodies from the Thames during the blackout of '77, saved children from burning buildings in Brixton. He wore the Queen's crest on his shoulder and served this country for 23 years. But when he knocked on doors in Kensington, people still said, 'Oh, you must be that new boy from the council.'" Caroline's lips parted, but no sound came. "And me," Elijah's voice dropped even lower, forcing everyone to strain to hear. "I was 24 years old in Kandahar province, route clearance for joint operations. We were escorting medical supplies when an IED flipped our vehicle off a bridge. The crowd was absolutely motionless now. My driver died instantly. An Afghan interpreter was trapped under the axle, legs crushed, crying for his newborn daughter. I spent 4 hours in that wreckage, broken ribs, blood in my eyes, keeping him conscious until the helicopters arrived." He drew a slow breath when the American contractor showed up to assess the damage. He looked at me pulling a man from the wreckage and said, "Who's the boy playing hero?" You could have heard a pin drop. "Boy," Elijah continued, "is what people say when they can't imagine you've carried something heavier than they ever will. It's what gets whispered when your bearing threatens. There's when stillness looks too much like dignity." A flush had crept up Caroline's neck, but she couldn't look away. "I've stood guard outside this palace during 3 separate terrorist threats. I've stood here while someone threw paint, screamed obscenities, played God Save the Queen on a kazoo. I've never moved, not once." He took a single step forward, not toward her but toward the space between them and the crowd. "Because stillness isn't weakness, it's discipline. It's knowing when to act and when to endure. It's carrying the weight of history without letting it break your spine." His voice rose just slightly, but it seemed to fill the entire courtyard. "This uniform isn't costume, it's not performance. It's woven from the threads of every person who stood in this spot before me. Every soldier who died so you could stand here safely. Every man and woman who learned that silence can be stronger than shouting." The crowd was leaning in now, hanging on every word. "You want me to sit down?" Elijah's voice carried a challenge that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with dignity. You want me to abandon my post because my presence makes you uncomfortable. He looked directly at her camera, then back at her face. I've been shot at by people who hate what this uniform represents. I've been spit on by protesters who think it symbolizes oppression. I've been ignored by politicians who think ceremony is just expensive theater. But I've never not once been asked to sit down by someone who is supposed to understand what service means. The words hit like a physical blow. Simple, devastating, true. This isn't about you, Miss Levitt. This has never been about you. This is about the idea that some things are worth standing for, especially when it's difficult. He straightened to his full height, shoulders square, chin level. So no, I will not sit down, not for you, not for your cameras, not for anyone who thinks dignity is negotiable. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't empty or uncomfortable. It was full charged with recognition and respect, and the understanding that everyone present had just witnessed something remarkable. Caroline stood frozen, her microphone hanging uselessly at her side. For the first time in her professional life, she had absolutely nothing to say, because a man who hadn't raised his voice, hadn't moved from his post, hadn't done anything but stand still and speak truth, had just given the most powerful speech she'd ever heard, and everyone knew it. From somewhere in the crowd came the sound of slow, deliberate clapping. Not applause, something deeper. The kind of rhythmic acknowledgement usually reserved for moments that change how you see the world. Then another person joined, then another barred. Not everyone. This wasn't a celebration or a performance. It was simply the sound of recognition, of respect freely given to someone who'd earned it the hard way. Elijah Ward didn't acknowledge the applause. He simply resumed his position, eyes forward, rifle at the proper angle, bearing perfect and unbroken. But something had shifted in the crowd, in the air, in the way people stood a little straighter and looked at each other with something approaching reverence. Captain Finch stepped forward one final time. Miss Levitt, she said quietly, your delegation is waiting. This time Caroline didn't argue. She turned toward her crew, toward the officials who'd brought her here, toward the exit that suddenly seemed very far away. As she walked back toward the palace gates, nobody followed her with their eyes. Nobody whispered about what she'd said, or how she'd looked saying it. They were all still watching. The man in red hood reminded them what it meant to stand for something. The man who'd refused to sit down. The man who'd chosen dignity over deference, principle over performance. The man who'd taught an entire courtyard that sometimes the most powerful response to being diminished is simply refusing to be smaller. And as Caroline's footsteps faded on the ancient stones, Lance Corporal Elijah Ward continued his watch. Steady, silent, absolutely unbroken. Because that's what guards do. They stand, no matter what. So what do you think? When someone tries to diminish your dignity, should you sit down to make them comfortable, or should you stand your ground, the way Lance Corporal Ward did in front of the whole world? And here's maybe the bigger question. In our age of viral moments and instant reactions, is there still power in choosing dignity over drama? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We genuinely read every single one. And these conversations matter more than you might think. If this moment moved something in you, if it made you think about respect and service in a new way, hit that like button. It honestly helps more than you know. Make sure to subscribe and tap that notification bell so you never miss our daily stories about the incredible men and women who guard these traditions with quiet strength. And if you know someone who still thinks silence means weakness, or that standing still isn't really standing up, share this video with them. Our next Royal Guard story is already waiting on your screen. Click it now, and we'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves the same truth over and over again. Real strength doesn't need to announce itself. It just stands. And when it does, even the loudest voices in the world discover they have nothing left to say.